My name is Liz Goodrich. Welcome to Deschutes Public Library's online programming. The program today is part of our series this October called No Mystery, where we're taking a look at things that may be a little mysterious that we need a little more information about to better understand. And we have invited Anne Crossman here today to talk about school at home. She is the author of Homeschool Like an Expert, Getting the Best Out of College, Study Smart, Study Less, and Trying to Remember. She attended Stanford and Duke Universities and has taught for 20 years in high school and college classrooms, military barracks, and around kitchen tables, publishing work in the Washington Post and being featured in USA Weekend and Chicago Tribune, among others. She offers a unique perspective on education as a former professional educator who was homeschooled as a child and has been homeschooling her children for the last 14 years. You can visit her current project at homeschoolexpert.com. And if you have questions for Anne throughout her presentation, please put those in the Q&A and we will be answering those as we go along. So Anne, take it away.
There we go. Thank you, Liz, so much for that introduction. I appreciate it. And thank you for making time on this beautiful weekend to join this conversation. My screen just switched off for just a second, so I'll pop it back and here we go. Also, thank you to Deschutes Public Library for hosting me as we talk about school choices and how important that is. Also, I just want to say thanks to Liz Goodrich, who's one of the supervisors at the library, who is very encouraging about hosting this topic. As Liz and I were talking about what's happening in the education world with mandatory vaccines for students K through 12 and teachers in public schools, we recognize that there's a potential that we could be entering into a tumultuous season for public schools and especially for families. So if teachers decline the vaccine and if parents are not comfortable having their children vaccinated against COVID, then what? So that's why we're here. Today, we're going to talk about the 4 schooling choices that every parent can exercise during the pandemic and how to make home education work with your work schedule while still providing a quality education. We're also going to talk about what to do about curriculum and then how to transition back into mainstream education. And as Liz said, if you have questions as we go, please type them into the chat or Q&A window, and I would love to talk about them at the end. You're here, I suspect, because you have questions about education this fall. We thought we started school, but maybe not. So before we launch into that conversation, I want to introduce myself briefly so that you know why I'm here. My name is Anne Crossman, and I am a former public high school English teacher. As such, I have a great deal of respect for the incredible work that our teachers have done to turn lesson plans digital almost overnight in order to engage our kids in classrooms over Zoom during the pandemic. I can only imagine how hard that has been. I'm also a former homeschooler. My parents taught me from home for 6 years in order to pull me out of what was a toxic school situation for me. And from there, I transitioned into public high school and went to Stanford and Duke Universities. I'm an author. I've published 4 selling books on education, such as the ones you see on your screen, Getting the Best Out of College, Study Smart, Study Less, and Homeschool Like an Expert after teaching in public schools and to our enlisted soldiers in Korea. I'm the founder of Homeschool Expert. It's a practical resource for all parents from any background, equipping them to teach their children from home with excellence. I believe that almost any parent can homeschool their child when provided with the right information. So I took 3 decades worth of experience in the homeschool community and distilled it down into one easy resource, which is either a book or a video series so that any parent can homeschool like an expert. Lastly, I'm also a parent. I've been homeschooling our 4 children since 2006. One of whom is now a junior at our local high school who has transitioned beautifully into mainstream education. Intended as a compliment, one of his teachers actually told me during his freshman year that my son was an incredible student and she couldn't even tell he'd been homeschooled. My younger 3 are still homeschooled. All of these experiences have led me to believe 2 principles, which are on the next slide. First of all, principle number 1, Liz, if you can pop to the next slide, please. Whoops, that's not it. Oh, I didn't tell you to pop ahead on other slides. You're doing great. You can go into the next one where it says the 2 bullet points. And there are my 4 kids that I homeschool. Okay, so the first bullet point is there's more than one way to educate a child. You will hear some people say the only good school is public school, or the only good school is private school, or if you truly loved your child, you'd homeschool them. And I am not one of those people. Point 2 is whether or not you homeschool your child does not prove how much you love your child. I was a competitive swimmer for many years growing up. And when my children wanted to learn how to swim, I hired a swim coach. Hiring someone else to teach my daughters freestyle did not mean I loved them any less than if I had taught it to them myself. It just meant that I thought the coach was a better choice. Some of you listening might be nodding in agreement saying, that's right, I have no desire to ever homeschool my child, and yet here I am. Sometimes circumstances get the best of us. It was certainly never my mom's life ambition to teach me from home. She only did it because she was desperate and out of options, which is why many of us find ourselves here today. Almost anyone is capable of homeschooling. So let's start with choices. And you can go to the, almost the next slide, not quite. Most parents are surprised to discover that there are 4 different categories of homeschooling. And the differences matter in terms of time and money. There are public, private, public homeschool, and private homeschool. And each are available online, in person, or some combination of the two. How you choose to homeschool your child will impact your flexibility, your financial cost, and your freedom of choice. So that's what I want to break down for us today. Traditionally, there have been 3 categories for schooling from home, but thanks to COVID, now there are 4. When schooling at home during COVID began, the media was all abuzz with suggestions, most well-intended, but from people who had never actually schooled from home before. And they were talking about how to homeschool on the fly. As a result, a lot of parents experienced frustration with not having the right tools to homeschool well. Homeschooling is actually very different from traditional education, and as a result, many of the suggestions were not helpful for parents. So let's look at this chart and see how the difference matters. On the left, there are 4 education categories: public, private, public homeschool, and private homeschool. Above them are then 2 versions for each category: offline and online. You can see that because of COVID, all 4 categories of education are now offered at home, either online or offline. The terms for these categories can vary a little bit by state, but the general descriptions still apply. The key factors to consider across these 4 types of schooling are cost, autonomy, and authority. And what I mean by that is the financial cost that families must pay outside the traditional classroom for online memberships or curriculum, the autonomy to decide how, when, where, and what to study, and the authority to determine grades and tests, teacher requirements, and classroom hours, such as what month are we going to start school and what days of the week are we going to school and at what times. Public school online. So starting top left is public online school, which was part of the traditional school district long before COVID-19. These courses were designed to be offered online through the district as part of its approved course load, using pre-recorded lessons, interactive digital recording material, and online exams. These online courses are still available within many districts, but like other classes, typically you must enroll in them prior to the beginning of the semester. They're also fully under the authority of the school district as part of the official public school curriculum. The key differences to point out about public online school is that parents are not responsible for the cost, nor do they have the authority to choose the brand of curriculum, the day of study, or the format. All that authority belongs fully to the school. So cost is low, autonomy is low, authority is low. Next category is public school offline. Offline public school is emergency public school at home, also called Zoom schooling, and is what a lot of families enrolled in public school experienced at the beginning of COVID. Offline public school is regulated, evaluated, and funded by the state. Even though it occurs within a student's home, by definition, offline public school is not actually homeschooling because the district is still in charge of when and how schooling is administered. It's a temporary solution to an emergency situation, and some families actually found it to be a good fit. As a former public educator, I have a ton of respect for teachers. Any challenges, by the way, that I may bring up about Zoom school are not at all a reflection on the quality of our teachers, but just of these difficult times. Similar to public online school, cost is low, autonomy is low, authority is low. The next category on the chart is private school online. There are many private online schools that have been a very helpful resource to parents during COVID. Developed with online study, assessment, and engagement in mind, these programs are often high quality. By enrolling in a private online school, cost is moderate to high, accountability is shared, and autonomy is low. The next category is private school offline. Similar to the traditional public schools, private schools developed their own routine and strategy during COVID-19, where work typically done in the classroom setting was transferred to an online at home. For this, the cost was moderate to high because parents were still paying tuition. Accountability is shared because both parents and school are running the day, and autonomy is low. Public homeschooling is a mystery for a lot of parents, and it's one of those categories most parents don't know about. Public homeschooling is a hybrid between public school and private homeschooling. Sometimes it's called charter schools, sometimes it's called public school at home. It really depends on the state. Parents who choose to homeschool through a charter are actually reimbursed by the state to cover a specific list of curricular and extracurricular expenses. So for the state of Oregon, it starts at $1,000 per student per year and can go up from there. Along with those funds come support and accountability from the state, requiring parents to meet with a teacher of record every few weeks, to design lesson plans, and to show proof of work. For parents who are new to homeschooling or who want more accountability, this can actually be a beneficial arrangement, offering a little bit of autonomy over content as well as support from the district. And within the category of public homeschooling, parents can select online, offline, or some fusion of the two, depending on the subject. It's worth noting that public homeschooling comes with strings attached, as it should. It's a slightly more malleable form of public school because it's located in the student's home on purpose. It's directed by the parent and the district, and it's partially funded by the state. So cost is shared, autonomy is shared, and actual authority is low. Private homeschooling is the last category, and it's the most customizable of all the forms of schooling. It is the traditional form of homeschooling that actually sought legalization back in the 1980s. Parents who choose this model do so because they want to tailor the pace, the curriculum, the schedule, and the focus of their child's education. This form of schooling provides families with the greatest amount of autonomy, empowering them to customize their curriculum and their school schedule to fit their needs. Similar to public homeschooling, parents can select online or offline or a fusion of the two, depending on the subject. So that means cost can be moderate to high, autonomy is high, and authority is high. Take your pick. Which of these four modes best fits your family is really up to you. Your family is not my family. Your method of schooling may not be my method of schooling, and that's okay. Consider the trade-offs of cost, autonomy, and authority, and ask yourself, what is the best way to prioritize those given my family's needs? What about my child's needs? Are there creative ways to make this actually work with my work schedule if both parents are working? And the answer to that is yes. We'll get there later. Check out also the video Homeschool Expert Quick Start Guide for more details, or you can watch our lessons 1 through 3 for free on our website, homeschoolexpert.com. Parents in the US retain the legal right over their child to disenroll from or re-enroll in public school at many points in the year if they meet their state's criteria, even in the face of COVID. Every state has different requirements, so check out the links on homeschoolexpert.com to discover yours. And the next slide that Liz will show up for us shows you where on the website you can find that link, as well as what the link looks like once you go there. If you want to click again, Liz, it'll pop up the map. Thank you. I will also add that homeschooling is a lot like a wedding. It costs as much money as you have to spend. I have seen parents provide an excellent education by purchasing beautiful high-end curriculum. They hire private tutors, they send their children on international learning tours. I have also seen parents provide an excellent education with a very modest budget, handing their students a math book, a library card, a reading list, and internet access. Parents often talk about homeschool's flexibility and adaptability as being some of the key benefits. So keeping that in mind, there is nothing magical about having school on a weekday morning between September and May. Let's think outside the box for a moment. What would it look like to homeschool over the weekend for half the day and then finish up school together in the weekday evenings or whenever you're off work? What would it look like for one parent to teach math and science and the other to teach history, literature, and writing? And by combining them in that way and doing less work, they're tackling multiple subjects at once. What would it look like to cover fewer hours of schoolwork every week over a 12-month period instead of a 9-month period? At the end of the year, the time or day of the week is honestly irrelevant as long as your student has mastered the material. And With a ratio of 1-to-1 or even 1-to-4, depending on how many kids you have, it takes 2 to 4 hours a day to school an elementary student, much less than the actual school day. It takes 4 to 6 hours to school a junior higher and 5 to 7 to school a high schooler, and that's including all the homework they need to do. I have known dual income households where parents space out shifts and divide subject areas between them to cover during the week. I've known single moms who teach their children the core content on the weekend, and then they leave their kids with online assignments to do with Nana while she goes to work. Then mom comes home in the evening to check the work and answer any questions. It's a lot of work, but it works. I've also known neighborhoods where each household hosts pod school for 1 day a week, and the neighborhood kids rotate between houses, sort of in an old schoolhouse model. As long as we're still talking about homework, many parents I talk to actually assume that homeschooling feels a lot like doing homework at the end of the day. But there are 3 key differences, and it's important because it gives parents this feeling of homeschooling, I could never do that. I hate doing homework with my kids. So let me break down those differences. First, parents who coach their students on homework in the evening may not know the context for the lesson or the teacher's expectations. Second, they are likely working with a student who is very tired from having been in school all day. And third, they have to drill their students through completing all the work, whether or not their student understands the concept or is tired of the concept or mastered the concept weeks ago. That honestly sounds a lot harder to me than homeschooling, where I customize the lesson to my student's needs. We get it done in the morning while my student's fresh, and he leaves the table feeling accomplished and ready to tackle the rest of the day. Both methods involve books and a kitchen table, but the process, the autonomy, the flexibility, they're completely different. So let's talk about budget. A good place to start in assessing whether or not homeschooling is a fit for your family is the cost. The average private homeschooling family spends about $800 per student per year on education-related costs, with that number potentially decreasing for families who have multiple children when they're able to share textbooks and share costs, sometimes as low as $400 per student, and that's for the privatized homeschool. It's an incredibly valuable exercise to build a homeschool budget, including fees for co-ops or extra homeschool classes along with curriculum. In that budget, also estimate the money that you're going to be saving by serving the kids leftovers for lunch instead of having to fix special school lunches, by spending less money on clothing fads that your kids may want for school that they don't even know exist now that they're home, by reducing cell phone plans for your kids if they have them, because if you need them, you just call them down the hallway. There are lots of ways to cut in the budget, and it's also worth looking at places where you can make your own trade-offs. So what conveniences would you be willing to give up so that you can pad your budget in other areas? Sometimes the driving impetus for homeschooling is the student, as was my case for my parents. It could be reasons that are social, academic, physical, or even stress-related. As was true in my own story, parents sometimes feel pushed into homeschooling, whether or not it's on their bucket list, because it just seems what's best for that child in that season. So if that's you, take comfort in knowing that you're not alone. Many parents share that same story of launching into homeschooling only because it's what their child needed. And that's why I created Homeschool Like an Expert, because I believe that any parent from any background on any budget can homeschool their child with the right information. You can find out more information in my book or video series, both titled Homeschool Like an Expert, and details for both are on my website. So let's talk about curriculum for a moment. When parents are trying to decide whether or not to homeschool, their first question is, where do I get curriculum? It seems like an obvious start. And Liz, next slide, please. It's obvious to us because school equals books, sort of. But please understand, I support curriculum, I like curriculum, I buy curriculum, but you should not buy curriculum as your first step. Buying books gives parents this artificial sense of security that they know what they're doing as teachers, but they don't. And when the curriculum arrives, there's no teacher in the box and parents stumble to know what to do next. So before shopping for curriculum, please pause and work through these 5 steps first. First, figure out which of those 4 homeschooling models I discussed earlier fits your family's needs and how to participate in homeschooling legally in your state. Secondly, identify your child's learning strengths and needs. We have a free resource on the Homeschool Expert website called the 10Q test, where you can ask your kid 10 questions, none of which it's possible to fail, and find out, are they a visual learner, a hands-on kinesthetic learner, or an auditory learner? Thirdly, find a couple possibilities for building community. Fourth, get your home resources ready to make your learning time successful, and I'll break these down more in a moment. Fifth, invest in yourself, the teacher, by learning homeschool fundamentals. And then at the very end, you can shop for curriculum. So let's look at those first three. The first three of the topics are the first three videos in our free series on homeschoolexpert.com, so please check them out. There is an ocean of resources now for home education, so it's understandably overwhelming to see just how many math curriculums are out there. Knowing these first 3 points will actually help you narrow down your resource shopping and make the choices a lot easier. For example, for the first point, if you decide to pursue public homeschooling, where the state reimburses you for curriculum, they actually give you a very limited list of companies that you can use for purchasing books. To the second point, knowing your child's learning strengths, knowing how do they learn well, will strongly influence what kind of books you buy. Is he capable of sitting in a seat for more than 5 minutes at a time? I'm sorry, incapable, because if you can't sit there for more than 5 minutes, by all means, do not buy a stack of workbooks that are all fill in the blank, because you're both going to hate it by the end of the day. Look for curriculum instead that offers more hands-on learning experiences. To the third point, a homeschool community can be hugely life-giving and an excellent resource for sharing or discovering great books. Everyone asks the fourth point. I don't know why it's such a popular question, but they ask, do I need an actual schoolroom in my house to homeschool? Fortunately, the answer is no. Across 35 years in the homeschooling community, I can count on one hand the number of families I have known who've actually had and used their homeschool classroom within their home. The kitchen table works just great. That's what I use. But there are definitely inexpensive tools that you can bring to your kitchen table that will make a big difference in the year's success. Finally, to the fifth point, invest in yourself as the teacher. You realize you may not need the most expensive math curriculum out there once you know how to teach your child. Sometimes you just need a workbook and some chocolate chips, and that's more than enough. I covered practical tips on how to narrow down the curriculum search in Homeschool Like an Expert. Sometimes life does not afford us a lengthy amount of time to make a school switch. There could be a job loss, there could be a tragedy, a surprise road trip. If that's your situation, I can certainly empathize. I have lived through that, and it is very hard. I've also counseled families through that kind of transition successfully and used those same principles to create the Quick Start Guide to Homeschooling, which is both a chapter in the book as well as one of the videos. So we'll come back to some of these steps in a moment. But beyond that, I want you to be encouraged. You know and love your child better than anyone, and even if you can't teach the content, you can still supervise your child's education at home because you have a way to find someone who can. Next slide, please, Liz. Thank you. Whether you have a vast budget that includes international travel, private tutors, and museum memberships, or whether you can only afford to hand your child a math book, a library card, internet access, and some direction, I have truly seen families succeed with both. Families have been homeschooling for centuries. This is not a new education model or a new way to learn. The smartest thing then that we can do as parent teachers is to learn from those who've gone before us, just like all good history books say, so that we can learn from history to repeat the wins and avoid the mistakes. So I encourage you, find an expert locally in your community somewhere, or come find me and let me help you start your homeschool journey strong. On the next slide, you'll see the address for where you can find these free resources I've been talking about today. And on the slide following that is a promo code where if you type in DPL for Deschutes Public Library 20, you will get 20% off the video series. I hope this has been helpful, and I'd love to take any questions you might have.
I have a couple of questions, Anne.
Yeah.
So that the four categories that were on that one of the first slides of the public-private was really helpful in trying to. I did not homeschool my children, and I've always had a lot of questions, and so that table was really helpful to understand.
Good, thank you.
So let me get this right. How does the ESD fit in? Where does the ESD fit in? The educational support districts that are funded, where do they play a role in homeschooling?
Yeah, and every district has their own name for those. So in case people watch this who aren't from our district, can you describe what an ESD does?
Me personally?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, so
you're on the Redmond School Board. You're the best person to tell us.
They provide support in areas where the school district doesn't necessarily have the resources to provide support. So they do driver's ed, and they support homeschoolers, and they provide our legal team. They sort of do these overarching services to a service area. So we're
Correct.
Yeah.
We're not alone. Yeah. So we have a high desert education area that supports Redmond, Bend, Lapine, and other surrounding areas. I don't actually know how wide it goes. I just know that I'm in their circle. And you are correct. A lot of the resources that are available to a public school student are also available to my kids as homeschool students because I pay taxes. Unfortunately, when I choose to homeschool my kids, I don't get to opt out of the public school taxes part. So I know a lot of people who are worried about homeschooling and it's going to undermine the schools by taking money out of the schools. It's like, no, I still pay taxes to my local school. And so because of that, I have access to speech therapists at the school if I need them, driver's ed, Spanish class, if I want my kids to just go to a couple classes a day, they can be on a sports team. All that is possible for parents who choose the private homeschooling model. For parents who choose the public homeschooling model, which is that charter school, state reimbursed one that we talked about, that can change it slightly. So there was one family locally who wanted to do the public homeschool model, but then they realized that their son could no longer participate in orchestra at the local high school if they accepted money through the charter school, because now it did subtract the funds away from the local school and shift them to the charter school pocket. So if you think your child is going to be interested in pursuing some of those resources, it's important to talk to the high desert services first and find out what's doable.
Right. Interesting. Can you share with us a couple of the most exciting moments of you being a homeschooler with your kids? Like, what were some of the best lessons, some of the best experiences that you have had with your kids as a homeschool teacher?
We've had lots. It's a very nice question. It's not so much a moment, I think, as a general theme for me. So like anything that we teach our kids, we're all teaching our kids something all the time, even if it's not English, right? Or math or science. We're all teaching them how to tie their shoes and how to make their bed and how to make scrambled eggs and how to pack their backpack and get ready on time and all that. So to have an area where we have struggled together, such as one of my kiddos is on the spectrum, autism spectrum. And I had to teach how to read 5 times to that child, even though I had taught my other kids at a young age and they had taken off and done super great. This one really, really struggled. And we wrestled with it together for years. And I brought in her ABA therapist and we worked together. And so the day that I had to trick her into reading, she discovered she loved reading, was just so much more an enormous win for me than teaching all 3 of my other kids combined in some ways, because the harder we work for something, almost the sweeter it is when we get it. And the way that I tricked my autistic child is not as dastardly as it sounds. I had actually downloaded ebooks from the library, which I cannot say enough. I'm always plugging the library and their ebooks. Oh my word. We have saved so much money in fines over the years from lost books and other dogs eating a book and whatever else, because we just bought a Kindle and we download those ebooks. And even with COVID, with the library shutting down, we loved our ebooks. So anyway, I gave her a Kindle with a book on it. Now I know how big the book is, right? If she had gotten it in person, the spine is like this. The words are big, but I knew she could do it. But I knew she would never try if she saw the size of the book. So I gave it to her as a Kindle and she totally got into the story and started reading it. It was a page turner and she loved it. And then when she was done, I think it was Pippi Longstocking, I went to the library and got the actual hard copy and I brought it home to her. And I said, "This is the book you just read." She goes, "What?" She was so mad initially. And then she was so proud of herself because she never thought she could do it. And so those kind of moments, knowing my child well enough to know that that's not a bad deceptive thing to do to my child, but actually a helpful on-ramp into discovering, oh, I love reading. Now I can't keep this kid out of books. It's like, please stop reading books and come back to the table so we can clear it and do dishes and get ready to go. So that kiddo loves reading. So I think that theme is a big one. I think the other theme I would lean into, I mean, there are lots, but I'll just pick two, is my own experience being homeschooled, as well as my experience with my kids being homeschooled, is that we do so much of life together that our memories are really like enmeshed in the best possible way. So that with my brothers, so much of our childhood stories and experiences are together that we can still reflect on them and share them and make them come alive again in stories because we lived them together. The forts that we made in blackberry bushes. I grew up in Grants Pass, or the mud fights we had in the river in October when it was freezing, and how one of my brothers liked to hide rocks inside the mugs before he threw the mud blobs, and whatever. We share all that, and I see my kids doing the same thing. So it's fostered opportunity for them to know each other as friends, no matter where we've moved, or no matter what struggles or sufferings we've been through as a family, and we've certainly been through some. Their relationship has been closer, and I think that encourages me as their parent to say, someday, if things happen as we expect biologically they will, I won't be here and they still will, and I'm confident that they will have the relationship as adults because they've had this history together. So those are two of the things that I really like about homeschooling.
Thank you. Okay, so just one other question, then we do have a couple of questions coming in, but I'm curious about when you have kids, you have kids of different ages doing different curriculums. I mean, do you find them exchanging information? And so what they're learning is not necessarily limited to their own grade level because they're hearing their older siblings do this other work?
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it. So I actually attended school where my first and second grade classroom, prior to being homeschooled, that is, was merged. And so I attended as a first grader. They advanced me to being a second grader at one point, but being in the classroom before they did that, I could hear everything the second graders were learning and was able to absorb that along with my own curriculum. So I've seen it happen in traditional classrooms. And yes, it absolutely is happening through homeschooling, where if a lot of our literature, history, and geography, I've chosen curriculum that we do together. So I sit down with 3 kids that span, let's see, grades, what are they? 8th through 4th grade. And we all sit down and we're reading the same literature together, geography, history. I have different assignments that I require from them, right? I'm not going to ask the 4th grader to hand me a 5-paragraph essay like I will the 8th grader talking about the book we just discussed. But we can still read and discuss the same book. So again, it puts them on the same footing in terms of shared experience. The younger one is most certainly learning from the older one, and the older one is actually learning from the younger one. So there are all these great studies that have been done on the value of having to narrate or review what you know. And so when the older sibling hears the younger one ask a question about 5 times 4 and turns to them and says, oh no, so what you imagine is like it's 5 bricks this way and 4 bricks that, right? And the older sibling kind of explains how they think about it. It's just reinforced the learning for the older student and engaged the younger student, and they're becoming buddies and friends over it. And the younger student's like, wow, everything my older brother does is great. I want to be like him and do math. I have, especially with math, I would say that so often my kids have encouraged each other more in getting their math done than I ever could, because they sit down side by side and are like, you can do this. I'm gonna help. Not that I'm relegating my role as teacher to them at all. That's my job, not their job. But when they have their individual time to do their work and they sit down and do it together, they're both benefiting from that process.
Awesome. That's great. Okay, we have a couple of questions. First question is, finding secular homeschool materials is difficult. It is also hard to find the scope and sequence for open and go resources.
Yes.
I've used Kathy Duffy in the past, but many materials are not secular. Is there anything else out there?
Yes, that's great. And by the way, I don't see any of the chat questions, so I'll just thank you for reading them off to me.
Yeah.
Yes, there is secular curriculum absolutely coming out. And I don't know if you have a subject in particular that you're looking for. Just recently, I typed in secular homeschool resources into Google and got lots of people's different blog sites. But I have something coming that's even better for you. So I think one of the most frustrating things for parents during COVID was trying to figure out where to find all this stuff. Quite honestly, there's not a good nexus in the homeschooling world, like Fred Meyer, right? The one-stop shop or the Walmart where you're like, I go here and I get everything. There has never been anything like that. And so parents have to customize and bootstrap it and find it for themselves. And it takes dozens, if not hundreds of hours worth of work. So It took us a little bit of time to put it together because of COVID, but now we're launching something in a couple of weeks called Ready Made School. And you can go visit that website and look at the resources that we have, because what we've done is we've organized them into 4 categories. So you'll have secular video-based K through 12. You'll have secular book-based K through 12. You'll have faith-based book-based and faith-based video-based, all K through 12. So if you're looking for a 7th grader, you need his curriculum and you want it to be secular, you can visit the site and see what we've got. We've also been able to get wholesale discounts with a lot of the curriculum companies, but if you don't want to use us, you can just look at the site and say, okay, this is what they picked. I'll go order it directly or find it at the library or borrow it from a friend or whatever else I'm going to do. But at least what we've done is we've taken some of the very best curriculum out there. And certainly there's more than what we're showing, but we've made it really simple. So it's like, you need a science book, here are 2 choices, not 50, 2. And they both work great. And we vetted them and go for it. So that website is supposed to come up October 16th. So if you have the ability to wait a few weeks, that's great. Otherwise, I think it's an excellent question. And if you join a local homeschool group, there's one called, oh man, I'm spacing on the name. If you go onto Facebook and type Bend Homeschool onto Facebook, there are lots of free groups you can join, and then you can send questions out there as well, saying, hey, I need a secular, this kind of book or curriculum. Does anyone have any recommendations? And sometimes you'll get responses that way as well. But feel free to reach out to me at homeschoolexpert.com. I may end up creating a resource that directs people to secular resources, just because I think it's such a great question.
So a follow-up question also, what is the best way to prepare for reintegration into the public school system? My kids are happily homeschooled right now, but if they show interest in public schools, I'd like to be ready for the transition. What are your suggestions?
Thank you. So it depends on the grades the children are in. Prior to 8th grade, the transition is much easier than it is going into high school, because the school system actually requires nothing from you. Honestly, that's the easy answer. You don't have to do anything technically to put your child back in school. So when I put our 8th grade homeschool student into his freshman year of high school, it was his first time ever being in a classroom outside of preschool. I went to the guidance counselor ahead of time and said, I called her a year before and said, what do you need from me to enroll him in classes? Do you need proof of something? Do you need standardized tests, essay examples, what? And she said, no, I don't need anything. Like, we trust parents that whatever classes they sign up their kids for, they actually want their kids to do well. So they're not going to sign them up for something they can't handle. And if something needs to change, we'll change their schedule, but we don't require anything. And I think coming out of COVID, especially with the thousands upon thousands of students who are going to be transitioning back into the mainstream, the school districts don't have capacity to review forms or require documentation or testing. I think they're just nobody knows yet, but I think they're just going to welcome everybody back with open arms. That being said, there are ways that you can voluntarily make that transition easier for your school district and for your child. So even though our local high school did not require anything for my 8th grader going into 9th grade, I walked into our first meeting with this folder that I had prepared that included a sample essay he had written, a sample science lab he had done, our most recent state scores from standardized testing, so they could see where he landed, across his peers, and so on. Just like a little sampling, a little crosscut of something we had done in each subject during the year, and brought that into her so that she could help me identify which class level he actually belonged in and not just take my word for it. And she was so grateful. She was like, I can't believe you did this. This is such a big help. Thank you. Not to have to force it or require it. This was amazing. So as you're homeschooling your kids this year, if you find a piece of their work that you're like, this is a good indicator of the type of work my kiddo is doing, in the second half of the semester, pull it out and just stick it in a folder. I rip it right out of the book and just stick it in a folder, and come April or March or whenever it is that you go back to enrolling them for next year locally, you can take that folder with you and say, look, this is how far we got. This is how well he's doing. What do you recommend?
So the same person wants to know, the person's students are currently in the 6th and the 3rd grade. And this is just offered as a follow-up to the original question of how do you reintegrate into public
Great. So because they're 6th and 3rd grade, even easier. High school is the hardest transition to make in terms of record keeping for what you need to prove or provide. The district cannot even require that you provide proof of grades unless you're homeschooling through the district, right? If you're doing public homeschool or Zoom school, as we were talking about before, then yes, the district can require grades and proof of work and projects and all that. But if you are private homeschooling, which means you sent in that letter of intent to the High Desert Education District, which happens every October. So if you haven't done it yet, this is a great month to do it. You send in a letter of intent, it's free. You say, I'm homeschooling my kids. They go, great. They don't ask for anything else. And for the state of Oregon, I believe it's grades 3, 5, 8, maybe 11, 3, 5, 8 for sure. They require you take a state test at the end of each of those 3 grades, just to make sure that your child is performing. Even if your child's underperforming, they don't require you do anything different. They just want to know where your child is in progress. And with COVID, again, those state testing requirements got put on pause because none of our traditional school kids could take state tests because nobody could proctor them because they couldn't be in rooms together. So even that restriction was waived. But in terms of the question of transitioning your kids back into school and not wanting there to be gaps, perhaps that's also what you're asking. And that's a very different question from record keeping. As I have talked with public educators who've been doing this for decades, the advice that they're all giving is the same, as well as the advice I'm hearing from the homeschool parents, which is really interesting. They're saying, look, if you can just get your kid a math book and make sure they're reading lots of really good books, go to your library, right? Lots of really good books, they're going to do fine. Find ways to give them historical fiction so that they're getting a little bit of history in there. There's so many great comic books at the library. They're like history. What's the one with the mouse, Liz? His name escapes me. Geronimo Stilton. My son loves those historical comics book. Just eats them up. He's learned about stuff I have never taught him because he just loves reading those. So find really engaging, fun resources like that. We go to the library, I want to say twice a month. We bring home a stack and I just leave them here, kind of like snacks, like brain snacks. And I leave them sitting out in some place where we hang out, and the kids will just pick from stuff, and they don't always read it all, and that's fine. Sometimes they come with me and pick things out. But by exposing them to material, by holding them accountable to keep doing math and what have you, they're going to transition in so well. So many kids have struggled through the Zoom school platform because it cannot engage learners across all their different learning styles, right? That kinesthetic hands-on we talked about, a lot of them are getting left in the dust. Or the auditory may also be struggling because there's so much confusion going on with all the people on screen. They're losing some of that. The visual may be doing well, but that's only a third of our kids. So a lot of our schools are going to be facing the challenge of how to transition students back in, how to do a lot of review. Are they going to spend a semester on review? Nobody quite knows what it's going to look like yet, but if you're reading and you're doing your math, you're off to a great start.
Right. So this just isn't, I think this is the final question. This goes back to the earlier conversation about science curriculum. The question is, science has been the hardest subject to source. Materials will say secular, but will be neutral. And I don't speak homeschool language, so I'm not quite sure.
And can you repeat that part? They will seem secular, but be neutral. Is that what you said?
Materials will say secular, but will be neutral.
Can that person type me a follow-up? What is it they don't like about neutral that they're looking for with secular? So I know how to answer that.
Yeah, so anonymous attendee out there who submitted this question, if you want
a great question,
a little more information for Anne so she can answer a little more accurately. And while you're doing that, I will say that Deschutes Public Library, the librarians do provide support for homeschooling folks, and I think in a very robust way.
Yes. Let me brag on Sheila Greer. Is that how I say her last name for a minute? Yeah. I love Sheila. Okay. So for the last 3 or 4 years, I go to Sheila and give her a list in like August with a calendar name like September, October, November, December, and then a topic. We're going to learn about weather patterns in September for grades 4 through 8. Can you set aside some books for me, please, during the first week? And she will, and I'll go in the first Friday of every month. And there Sheila's stack is. I don't even think I've met her in person, but we've dialogued for years over email. And I'm, dropping off, like, I think I dropped off some Blizzard tokens to her for DQ. I hope I did. I keep thinking about it. Sheila, if not, I need to drop some off. But it's free. It's this free service the library provides. And Liz is absolutely right. It's very robust. Anything I come to, there are also these curriculum crates the library has. that you can sign up for and get in line, right, for those, or they can custom make something. If you're like, hey, we want to learn about the Holocaust, but I really don't want it to give my kids nightmares. Do you have some books you can recommend? And Sheila or the team there can look those up, and is really excellent. While you're also typing your science question feedback, is it coming in, Liz? Are we getting?
Yeah, it is.
Clarification? Okay, go ahead. Ben,
so she says, or the attendee says, sorry, neutral in science will avoid talking about evolution.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. So you're right, there are some science curriculums out there, such as brain lapse. We own it. So I'm trying to science for kids, and it has the number 4, science for kids. And it's a neutral science program because it does not spend a lot of time talking about evolution. It is very neutral. I think the challenge historically, so it's interesting. I think there's an assumption, let me back up and give you the big picture. There's an assumption that homeschooling is a Christian-y thing to do, right? There are a lot of faith-based everything in that market space. But interestingly, homeschooling was actually not started in the US by faith-based families. It was pushed by hippies. And so initially, a lot of the curriculum that was kind of being developed in the 60s, 70s was very secular. But technology hadn't caught up yet, so we don't have access to those resources. Then in the 80s, there was this guy named Robert Moore who wrote a book, Better Late Than Early, about boys not being put in school too early. And he went on a Dr. James Dobson podcast and a Phil Donahue show, and the Christian world really embraced the opportunity to educate from home, and they developed resources that reflected their belief system. So that's why there are so many science courses and resources that are available that are faith-based. Because the market is still predominantly faith-based, curriculum developers would be totally shooting themselves in the foot if they put out a secular-based science material, because such a large percentage of the market probably wouldn't buy it. Now, the homeschool world is changing. We are seeing families come in from all different faith backgrounds, and secular and neutral and all that, and it's wonderful, and we love that. But it's just going to take curriculum a little bit of time to catch up for that. So in the meantime, what a lot of families have done who are looking for secular resources is they actually go to a secular curriculum company like Scholastic or Pearson, which I guess has changed its name to Sassel or something else recently, or Workman Publishing, Workman Press, right? Usborne Books is another great one. They'll go to these curriculum companies that are taught through school as a standard resource and buy through them. So homeschoolers can still access those books as well. And I've just mentioned Usborne to you. Usborne has been wonderful for us. I would find that that's very secular. I know faith-based families who use it, and they just talk about evolution with it as part of talking about what is that, but it's definitely talks about evolution in the Usborne books. Pandia Press, I can't recall if that's neutral or secular, but Pandia Press is often highly regarded for the resources that it offers as well. So I think I need to make up a secular resource based on your question, and so I can list all that stuff off later.
Awesome. Well, I really want to thank you today for the conversation. This has been really informative. And again, what's your website where people can reach out to you?
Yeah, if you go to homeschoolexpert.com, and sometimes I have, if you remember Dear Abby from back in the day, I have Dear Anne, so parents can email in and ask questions, and I'll address those on the site. In the coming weeks, we've got free podcasts, free tools that we're handing out to parents all the time, free book lists. There's, I did one this summer for the love of reading, and it's so many wonderful books over 2 decades that I have been sourcing and testing with families besides my own. And so again, to us talking earlier about 3rd and 6th graders and high schoolers and the whole range doing some great reading this year, that resource is there for you to use. There are free video lessons on how to understand your child's learning strengths, how to build a homeschool community, how to set up a flexible schedule during the day. So I would encourage people to check it out.
And one last encouragement to you is, please, a secular list would be amazing. That's the last.
Look for Ready Made School. That's great. Yeah, it's coming out in 2 weeks. ReadyMadeSchool.com. There's no website for it yet because it's still in beta, but it's going to have a whole lot of secular resources there, which will help.
Great. We really appreciate you, Anne, and everybody who was on the call today will be getting a survey to fill out to provide us feedback about today's presentation. A recording of this talk will be available on the Deschutes Public Library web calendar early next week. so you can rewatch it and write down all of Anne's great resources and where to reach out to her. So thank you. Anne. Happy homeschooling.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Have a great day.